and welcome to another episode of Faith, Friends, and Hustle. Today, I'm speaking with Jeremy Smith. Jeremy is a Christian, husband, father, author, and co-occurring program coordinator and clinical counselor. Jeremy, introduce yourself. What should we know about you?
I'm those things. I'm a person that just tries to do the best he can with what he's got, and used to be extremely introverted, and now I find myself doing a lot of public speaking and just trying to help those that are needing help. Helping, my life motto right now professionally is helping those that can't speak for themselves, and doing a lot of work in a couple different communities to help those with mental illness, and a lot of conversations around faith, a lot of conversations in the community just to make services and resources better for each other. So a little bit all over the place right now.
Yeah, busy time of the season. You and I were talking about for you before we jumped on here. And I know one of those communities you had mentioned that caught my attention was over the course of this last couple of months, whether it's just highlighted through me through the Spirit or I'm just paying attention to that. I've seen a lot of your articles and conversations come up about Christian leadership and then mental health and the aspects in that of when it go. And I don't think, anyone can look around over this course of this year, the last several years, and kind of see this just resurgence and what it looks like for mental health. And I've read several compelling articles from not only you, but other Christian leaders and too talking about it. And as you look around and notice our brothers and sisters that are struggling with this, it's shocking that we don't hear about it more, which is what led us to this conversation, because our churches are struggling across the board in some of these categories. And it raises a lot of questions about what's causing this and driving this when we have such good faith and servants in the church. Where's this division and stuff coming from?
Yeah. So I posted an article that just talked about leadership and mental health in general. But when I posted it personally on my own Facebook page, and I think that this is the specific conversation you're noting, is I gave it a little bit more personal aspect to it. This was born out of some concerns where in the month that I was doing some research for some stuff, I found 8 different references of pastors that were just failing. And this is across the nation. This isn't anything local. This is just pastors having some kind of moral failure, from something that was potentially going to get them locked up to things that just definitely not okay for a pastor to do. And so there was some big article across the United States that had this, and then also a couple of different churches that actually intentionally did not report something that was a mandatory reporting situation. And so that's what led to the conversation of where are pastors at for themselves? Because most of those articles, I read every single one of them, had talked about how they just were at a place where there was too much going on. There were some secrets happening, and that there was just no, I don't want to say not accountability, but there was just no outward boundaries and outward actual investments from other people. And so because of that, there was these pastors that were hopefully doing good work. I wasn't at their ministry sites or anything, but stepping down, and churches hurting because of it. So you could see some of the articles that talked about how churches were actually shutting down. One of them changed their name within a month of the announcements for it because they were just so much negative attention for it. And so when I think about leaders with mental health, I think about the stress that happens. I don't know how much you've talked about this on the podcast, but I constantly am hearing over and over again, and I see this for myself within what I am personally doing, that it's very lonely at the top. And with loneliness, that's where you get people that are trying to just seek understanding. They're trying to find community and friendship. That's where you get stuck in your head and you listen to your own internal, you're the most worthless person in the world, or you're like God's gift to everybody around you, which are both unhealthy. And so when you talk about leadership and mental health, it's really the idea of just, you need to be able to, first of all, trust God. That should be who you are relying on all things. Even though it's lonely at the top, you still have him. It doesn't matter what kind of season you're at in your life. Even if you're in the worst place in your life, you still have him. And then at the same time, just talking about the fact that you need to have a bit of humility to what you're going to. And that's a conversation you have in mental health in general, because it's easy to think that I'm stressed and I'm depressed, and then you lose that empathy and humility within who you are and that trust in God. And so it feels very lonely. It feels like I can't do anything like this myself. And in some regards, you can't. And leadership sometimes goes too far the other way too.
Yeah. Unpack that a little bit. What do you mean by too far the other way?
I think you can get into the sense of like, I'm the one that's making all these great decisions. I'm the one that's able to be successful. I find it interesting. There's this counseling skill that you have where you talk about how a person has been able to be successful in little things. And sometimes clients, when they're really, really struggling with something, it's really small things that help to get them just moving the needle a little bit in the forward.
Yeah.
You ask, how are you able to do it? And they don't know the answer to it because they didn't think they did anything amazing. But then when you ask someone that's done something great, you ask them, how did you do it? They don't have the answer for that either, because there's really nothing behind it other than like, well, I worked hard and I hustled for this thing, but they don't necessarily understand what the tools were that made that success. And sometimes it's God laid this thing out for you to make this happen for yourself, and you just were faithful in what you were supposed to be doing to actually be successful. So I think we have to make sure that we keep that in check as far as when we're thinking about being a leader. What are we doing for ourselves? And how are we making sure that we are relying on what God has provided and given to us in those moments?
Yeah, we were not built to be in silos.
No.
And how I received it when I hear you talk like that is that leaders are fighting themselves in silos, whether self-created or the culture or whatever is happening that's there, where they're going, hey, it's lonely at the top.
Yeah.
And now they have no one speaking into their lives.
Yep. Yeah. And I think from a pastoral standpoint, having done that before, I think that the difficulty is that there's an expectation. There truly is a power differential, regardless of the leadership you have. There's a power differential, and you have to recognize that that's the case, of not surrounding yourself with yes men all the time, of not having a congregation that's willing to come in and be like, Pastor, you did such an amazing job, because that feeds the ego of like, I'm amazing. And that's where you kind of let off the gas. If you talk about this idea of leadership and that hustle that you want to do, that's where you have to continue to invest in whatever it is that's around you, continue to push forward. But sometimes we get stuck in the ruts of like, okay, this is good enough and this is what I'm willing to do. And then things don't progress and you wonder what happened in that process, and you go seeking after things that you shouldn't be.
Yeah, it reminded me of a Pastor Dave during a sermon he had stated years ago. I wrote it down as one of the things where he had said that you can either have a routine or a rut team.
Yeah.
That always stuck with me because I looked back through some of the areas of my life, right? And there were some rut team things that were no longer serving me, but were actually doing injustice.
Yeah. Well, the Jim Collins version is the good to great, where we look at things. Are we doing the good stuff? Or are we doing the great stuff? Right. I would say even from a scriptural standpoint, are we doing the things that are feeding the things of ourselves, or the things that are more eternal? And my experience with leadership and what I've done is it's when it's my power that's is supposed to be happening, that tends to become frayed, and the doubts come back eventually, right? There's almost always some kind of doubts that feed into some of this stuff. And so when it's my own power, then I kind of get stuck in that of like, well, can I even do this? Whereas when I've seen that it's been something that God has done, I'm like, I don't know how it happened. God allowed it to happen. So I'm just going to keep pressing forward. And it's so much more freeing when it's this conversation that you're having, this vision, this calling that is part of your life. And it doesn't matter if that's fully secular or not fully secular at all, just to be able to know that there was a vision that was laid out for this, something that you are seeking after, as opposed to you thinking you can do it all and then feeling like it's really just made of light sticks that's going to come crashing down afterwards.
Yeah, it's where do you find your identity,
Yeah.
right? When I find my identity in Christ, I'm in a good place. When I find my identity from the situation or what's around me or my thoughts around that, fear tends to pop up, disappointment starts creeping in, lack of confidence, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think also the general pressures of leadership can be really, really difficult. Unless we know that within leadership, whether it's the top three positions that tend to have a lack of empathy are criminals, and then police officers, and then pastors, surprisingly, because it's hard to fire a bunch of people, right? It's hard to go and arrest someone when you don't know the situation and not having empathy. And then it's also hard to go in front of people and say, if you don't turn, you're going to hell. And sometimes that empathy is really, really difficult. So we call that in counseling, we call it antisocial behaviors. But to have that pressure, unless you were made to have not that empathy for other people, it's hard to have a leadership where, like we were just talking about beforehand, I have a grant that stopped for a couple of weeks and I'm hoping it returns. But those 4 people are not on my staff anymore. Not anything that they did great work. One of those people might be my best employee I've had, and she doesn't have a job right now because of that grant. And it just eats at you from a leadership standpoint. Am I doing enough with this job?
Yeah, it's so true. I'm also, during this conversation, I'm thinking of Hans, and I'm forgetting his last name, but he wrote a book, The 10 Mistakes Leaders Make.
Okay.
And there he references the servant leadership.
Yeah.
Jesus and how you serve. And I do think, as you stated, once you move into these silos and now we start finding our identity in the good things and what people are saying,
Mm-hmm.
it calls this switch from now you're serving your calling that God called you to now I'm just serving my ego, I guess, or whatever it could be. Yeah.
Sure.
Insert whatever that is.
Yeah. I agree. I think at the same time, just pushing forward, continuing on in and of itself doesn't do anything for people. There's something to be said for having that true motivation for yourself, whatever it is, internally, externally, for yourself.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Well, I think you've kind of answered this, but let's dive into this just to make sure we clarify. So what are some of the common stigmas associated with leadership, mental health within the church? Leadership, what you're seeing?
Just in general, I feel like leadership right at this moment has a great understanding of mental health. And to be clear, mental health and mental illness are 2 separate things. Mental illness is what I do. I work with clients that have mental illness, a diagnosable disorder. I don't myself have a diagnosis. I don't have mental illness, but I have my own mental health. And everybody has just health stuff, mental health being a piece of it. So we have our good days, we have our bad days, and so it goes up and down. I think that some of the stigmas, though, for leadership is it's a great conversation for everybody else. I think it's a great conversation for them, but not necessarily for us, however you want to define us. And I think that gets communicated very poorly and very unhelpfully to a team whenever that's being said, that you guys just need to take care of your mental health, because it's saying there's nothing wrong with me, it's you guys need to get this fixed, when in fact the reality is it's true for all of us. And so if the stigma is there, that means that it's for the weak-minded people. And if you're in a position of leadership, you can't be weak, you can't have those expectations for yourself. And so what we tell them to do is not what we tell ourselves to do, and it becomes really, really difficult, to the point of, this is true for pastors as well, that most pastors that I have interacted with, they believe in mental health. In fact, there's a whole, I think it's Barna, it's either Barna or Lifeway that has a research where, no, it's definitely Lifeway, because the research talked about how pastors, like, we talk about mental health all the time. We're discussing with our congregation, we're praying about it all the time. And then they surveyed the congregation of those pastors that they served, and they said it is not enough. And in fact, they don't recognize when it's happening as far as in the sermons, in the Sunday services. And so whatever the pastor thinks that they're saying is like a tenth of what's actually being communicated. It's not enough. And so it's just amazing how that there's that disconnect that's happening there, that either they need more that the pastor doesn't realize, or the pastor thinks that they're doing a great job and they have no clue what's actually being said. And then the other side of it is pastors, there's a second report that had happened, this one is Barna, that said pastors believe that people should get mental health when they need it, but have never sought it out themselves, even though they're more stressed now than they ever have been in the pastoral role before. And they won't seek any kind of clinical counseling, any kind of pastoral counseling, because that's for other people. And so there's the stigma even within themselves.
Yeah, fascinating when it comes through there. So how do we support leaders?
Yeah. How do we, I think just calling it out, the biggest thing about stigma is it hides in the dark. That if you don't talk about it, it has a place to fester. So just simply addressing this being able to talk about it, and from a place of not shaming them or ourselves or anybody else. I think that there's something to be said for rising up to that expectation that we can do better for that. So I think that those are really, really important things to happen. But then at the same time, asking a pastor how their mental health is doing and not willing to just accept, oh yeah, it's great, thanks for asking, but like, no, really, how are things going? And I realize that as a counselor, I'm saying that. And so when I to a pastor, that's a loaded question that I'm not asking in the middle of our lobby right after a service is happening. I'm asking in the hallway when no one else is around saying, how you doing? And I just give that counselor like a little extra emphasis, right? And I have good conversations with them. And I feel like at least for Crossroads staff, they're answering those questions and they're being honest and they're going through stuff and they're working on it. And they're no different than us. They have their own struggles. I know that's one of our pastors that helps with the group stuff and young adults. He just had a kid. Of course he's stressed because he just had a kid and going through all this stuff. I have one of my own staff that just had a kid and isn't getting enough sleep and just stressed about waking up and worrying that their child's even breathing, which is an irrational worry that all of us new parents have. And so that's okay that that's there for ourselves. But then to try to hide it and be like, yeah, things are fine. Things are great. It's wonderful. I'm blessed to be alive. And then they don't talk about those things. That's when that isolation that you were talking about, that siloing happens. That's when things tend to fester and get worse without any kind of ability to address the stuff. It's kind of like a wound. When you have a wound, you don't just leave it there and put it in the dark. That's when sores happen. That's when things get gross and infections happen. You actually have to give it some air, give it some light to just be able to clean it off and to make sure that it's taken care of, as opposed to hiding and not addressing it.
Yeah, I have certainly experienced this, seen it across the teams and leaders that I've worked with, that those who avoid the conflict or the difficult conversations seem to have the most conflict or difficult conversations, right? On eventually.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, to be fair, it all catches up to you, right? Whether it's the stress and the moral failings, whether it's the stuff that you hide in the dark, and we all have our sin, we all have our shortcomings, we all have our weaknesses. So to pretend like there's nothing there just doesn't make sense. But instead to go in front of God and to go in front of the people you have in your life, I think in the leadership standpoint, it's the Peter, James, and John that you have in your life, the three people that you're closest to, and letting them know what's really happening in your life. If you can't be honest with them, if you can't be honest with God, and that's saying something about where you're at for yourself, and maybe just having some time to address that for yourself is huge.
Yeah. I think you need to look at who have they surrounded themselves with, and who have you surrounded yourself with that allows you there. I wear a shirt all the time. It says "Think like a CEO." I get asked about it all the time, and I explain. I said, well, if God is the owner of my life, I view myself as the CEO in the agency, and I give people permission to speak into my life who are at the table.
Yeah. Agreed.
And I think everyone needs to have that in their life, someone who's speaking truth, guiding, and assisting as you walk with your journey, leadership, and with Christ.
Yeah. And if you're one of the people that's the support for the other person, don't hesitate to ask. Don't forget to ask. And don't forget to not accept everything's great, right? Because if everything is great every single time you ask, then they're lying to you. And if everything's great in that moment, then like hear about what's great and love that. But just make sure that they're being honest. Make sure that you're being honest, especially if you're one of that inner circle people.
Yeah. I think it also brings up a great topic for me, and this is another conversation, but something I wrote down I'm thinking about coming out of here is that how much time I spend discussing physical health, financial health, which I think there's less stigma now around financial health a little bit. I think people are more open to talk about it, but financial, spiritual health for sure. I don't think there's enough conversations even in my life either about the mental health and how are you working that muscle, if you would call it, just like you would any of the other. Right?
So to kind of give a context, there's actually a ton of information written about this, where we're trying to have people find healthiness. And this is from the person that's doing good and wants to take it to the next level to the person that's struggling so much that they don't even know how they want to stay alive anymore. And so when we talk about this, it's not just talking about struggles, it's talking about wellness in general, whether it's your marriage, whether it's your career, whether it's your finances. And so there's this thing called SAMHSA, which is a federal government that has billions of dollars to invest in research and everything. And they come up with this thing called the 8 dimensions of wellness. So it talks about emotional, physical, occupational, spiritual, social, intellectual, environmental, and financial. And so everything you said is on that plus a little bit more. So
Wow.
imagine the job that you are doing, not for the paycheck, which is important, but giving you meaning in your life. When a client comes in and struggles with depression and they say, man, I just need to get a job, I need to pay the bills, I'm like, that's great. But also, is it a job that you love? Because how many people are working a job that they don't love, but it's at least paying the bills? It's paying the bills, but they're also spending too much, but at least it's paying the bills. But they dread going to work. They're in their own recovery, and the place they're working at is a factory where people use on the job sites. How is that edifying to yourself? How is that actually helping you move forward in your recovery or in your life? And so having something you love to do in a place that you love to do it, with people surrounding you that you're like, I call you guys friends. Like, those are the things that we should look at as far as wellness for ourselves. And hopefully as leaders that you guys are creating those type of environments as well.
Yeah. Well, I have appreciated this conversation so far. We like to finish and wrap it because we could talk about this all day. I like to finish each one with, while I'm listening and I'm looking at this, I go, what do I walk away with? What should I take away? What's something you would like me to hear?
Yeah, if you were at a place, if we're talking about leadership and mental wellness, mental health, everybody has that for yourself. So when's the last time you took a minute for yourself? And from a spiritual standpoint, when's the last time you spent some time with God? When's the last time you just didn't go to him with a quick rapid fire, hey, I need help with this, like, thank you, God, for this, but just like went and talked to him, went and listened to what he had to say. I would say 5 minutes is tough. 20 minutes is really tough. What if you just spent an hour just listening to God and just trying to be there? If we talk about leadership and wanting to move the needle forward, have that conversation with God where you just say, God, what do you want from me? For me, my breath prayer, a prayer that you can say in a single breath, comes from Psalm. It says, lead me, O Lord. And so I breathe that in and I breathe it out of lead me, O Lord, and all the things that I do in my leadership within myself, my family, and others. But I have to listen to what God has for me to be able to do that. So that would be my one encouragement to you, to anybody else with your own mental health, in your own spiritual life, within your own business that you're doing, to have that for yourself.
Great advice. Great settlement. So you have something cool to share you were telling me about. Would you like to share that?
Sure. Yeah. So when we're talking about leadership, when we're talking about mental health, we talked about pastors and what does this mean for themselves. I haven't talked about this online yet, so this is my first time talking about it publicly outside of people I've networked. I'm working on a research project, so I'd love people that are listening to this that are praying that would be able to do that for me. When we talk about the difficulty in life, we have stuff called resiliency and fortitude, and how can we push through this for ourselves. And we know that there are more pastors quitting their jobs than are coming out of seminary, which is a problem. If you're losing more than you're gaining, that's a recipe for destruction. And the question is, why is that happening? What's going on for pastors? And some of the news that you hear, pastors are struggling with their stuff, right? You're talking beforehand of some of the stuff that's happening in the news, and it's not good for some of the negative stuff. So I've got this theory in my head that there's this thing in counseling we talk about called adverse childhood experiences. And there's 10 questions of childhood trauma they've had that lead to so many different things that we've had in our lives. Go look it up, go Google, what does adverse childhood experiences mean for people? It affects our ability to have relationships and go to college, our physical health, our mental health, all of these things in our life because of the things we experienced as kids. And it's hard to heal from that. It tends to stay with you for the rest of your life. Something terrible happens to me right now, I'll probably get over it, but when it happened to me as a child, it's there forever. And I wonder if the ACE scores for pastors are higher. In fact, my hypothesis is pastors' ACE scores are double what it is the general population, which means their ability to have resiliency is so much more important than it is for the average Joe. It's so much more important because of the work that they do and how difficult it is and how lonely at the top it is. And so I just want to start to have some conversations about it. Maybe I'm wrong and that's great, but also maybe we need to come up with some specific resources for pastors, given the nature of the work that they do. And so this research hopefully will be able to highlight some of that and maybe even start some conversations for pastors of what they could do more for themselves, what their churches can do for them, and then what they can do for their staff and their elders and their volunteers as well.
It only takes making a difference in one to have a ripple effect.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
Yeah. I'll be certainly praying for you. I know the listeners will be praying for you. Thank you so much. Yeah. Listeners, till next time, we'll talk to you soon.